Lesson 14. This presentation will look at the plural forms of personal pronouns. Under verbs, we will learn about the first aorist and the difference between tense and aspect. And we'll look at some constructions, conditional sentences, and different kinds of those, and then negation in conditionals. These are the singular personal pronoun forms that we have learned already. We've got the first person, second person, and third person, I, you, and he, she, or it. We're going to take a look at the plural forms in just a second. Before we do, though, we'll want to highlight that all of these right here are emphatic forms. That is, when we see them, almost always they are emphasizing the person or thing that we're talking about. In Greek, it's just not necessary to use pronouns as often as we do in English. So when we do, we're usually emphasizing them. Let's look at some of these plural forms. We'll start with the third person. These right here, autoi, autai, auta. Those are the different gendered forms of this. And just as in the singular, anytime we see something like this in the nominative, it's going to be emphatic. Now, to turn to the first and second persons plural for these pronouns, we're going to find that they are very similar, actually. The difference is that the first letter changes from he in the first person plural, the we, to hu, second person plural, y'all. And we see that actually throughout the declension. So the only difference between the first and second persons plural is the he or the who. And once again, these nominative forms are emphatic. When we see them, they are almost always emphasizing the pronouns, the people, places, or things they're referring to. So these are the forms now, both plural and singular, of the personal pronouns. These are the tenses we've looked at already. In Greek, the imperfect, the present, and the future. We're going to learn a new one today, and it is, in English, known as the simple past, in Greek, the aorist. As we know, the imperfect tense describes past actions in the process of taking place. For instance, epau etan logon, you could translate as, he was closing his speech, he was in the process of closing his speech, or even he tried to close his speech, or he began to close his speech, something like that. On the contrary, the aorist indicative also describes past actions, but it describes them as completed, as in not in the process of taking place, much like the simple past in English. He closed his speech. He wasn't in the process of closing it. He simply closed it. The aorist indicative is formed as follows. First of all, take the future stem of the verb we're talking about. So let's experiment with our verb pau all. I stop here. And we're going to drop our omega to get our normal present tense stem. And we get the future stem, of course, simply by adding the sigma there. Step 2, we add the appropriate aorist ending. We do have some new endings to learn here. The first person singular happens to be alpha. And then finally, add the past augment. In all past tenses in Greek, we add that past augment, which, with a verb like this that begins with a consonant, is simply going to be epsilon. So, epausa, I stopped, period. Not I was stopping, or I tried to stop, or I began to stop, but simply I stopped. These are the sound changes we see in the future tense. When your verb stem ends with a consonant, we actually see the exact same sound changes take place in the aorist tense. So we can recycle some of this knowledge that we already have. So let's take a look at a different kind of verb, like peta, I persuade. To get our future tense stem, we will drop our omega ending and add our sigma. And of course, theta plus sigma is difficult to pronounce, so the Greeks had a sound change take place, ended up with just sigma. Theta plus sigma equals sigma. And again, we would add our aorist ending, in this case the first person singular, our past augment, and get epesa, I persuaded, period. This is the conjugation of the first aorist for a verb like pa'al in the indicative. And a couple things to notice here. We have, of course, the sigma, and we also see, characteristic of the first aorist, the alpha in almost every person and number. In the third person singular, you do have an exception. And of course, the other thing to notice is that we have the epsilon, the past augment. But really, it's the sigma plus the alpha that is going to be distinctive of the first aorist, even in other moods like the imperative. Now, let's talk about the difference between tense and aspect. Technically speaking, the aorist is not a tense at all, but an aspect, that is, a way of representing an action. The imperfect is just another aspect of an action. Both are really past tenses. There's just one past tense, and there are different aspects that one can speak of something that took place in the past. The imperfect is one, the aorist is another. The same action can often be represented under different aspects. For instance, in English, I was doing homework last night. This would be what we could call the progressive aspect. And in English, in fact, this verb tense would be called the past progressive. We also have the present progressive, I am doing homework last night. Lots of different versions of the progressive. We also have I did homework last night. This in Greek would be the aorist. In English, it's really the simple past. What's important is the following. Both statements could be true. In the first, we have simply chosen to represent the action as in process, and in the second, as completed. If I did homework last night, presumably at some point I was in the process of doing that homework. And whether I say that I was doing the homework or I did the homework depends on the aspect under which I want to represent the action. We usually use the progressive aspect when we are emphasizing the fact that this was a process. Perhaps it was interrupted, perhaps it went on for a long time, perhaps the homework was really hard, perhaps it was my excuse for not doing something else, etc. There are lots of reasons why we might present this particular past action under a progressive aspect. As an aspect, the aorist can also be used to describe actions in moods other than the indicative. For example, the imperative. Listen to the wise, that is, habitually. For this, we would use a progressive aspect. And this is what we've seen so far. It's basically the present imperative is basically the progressive aspect for this action. So all the imperatives we've seen so far have been in the progressive aspect. They've been commands to do something on a regular basis or habitually or more than once. But we have something like also listen, as in right now, on this one occasion, once. To express something like this, a command like this, we would use the aorist imperative. The aorist is also seen and used with infinitives. For instance, to sacrifice to Apollo on a regular basis, you'd use just the normal infinitive we've used and seen so far, the present infinitive. This would be the progressive aspect. But if you wanted to talk about to sacrifice to Apollo right now, here and now, once maybe, on the spot, you would use the aorist infinitive. It would be a different aspect to present the infinitive, the action of the infinitive under. To get a better sense of the distinction, try translating the progressive as be doing something. For instance, if we look at that imperative, listen to the wise habitually, the progressive aspect of that, we could translate it, or could mentally translate it as be listening to the wise, as in be in the habit of listening to the wise. Whereas we can translate the aorist imperative as just a simple listen to the wise. These are the forms of the aorist imperative and infinitive, just 3 new forms. Just as before, we see the sigma in at the end of the stem, and we also see alpha in at least 2 of the cases, here and in the infinitive down below. The reason this is in red is because, with one exception, it's actually identical in form to the indicative form. Y'all did stop. The only difference, of course, is that here we're missing the epsilon, the past augment. So this is close, not exactly the indicative form, but it's something to be aware of. So these are the forms for the first aorist imperative and infinitive. Pausan, you, singular, stop. And that would be the aorist imperative. Pausate, you all, plural, stop, whatever you're doing. Not on a regular basis, but this one time, right now. Let's turn to something a little bit different, conditional sentences. We have already encountered simple conditional sentences in Greek. For instance, Etis estin en megarois uk estin en Athenais. This is that sort of logical joke or absurdity. If someone is in Megara, he's not in Athens, obviously. The if part of a conditional sentence like this is called the protasis. This is the protasis. It is what is put in front. Pra, in front of, before, and then it's a form of a Greek verb titeme, which means I put or place. The then part of the sentence is called the apodosis. This is the apodosis there. We can talk about these things as the if and the then parts of the sentence, or the protasis and apodosis of the sentence. The protasis and apodosis terms are what you'll usually see in grammar books to describe these. This particular type of conditional, this one we're looking at right here, etis estin en megarois, etc., which can be translated literally, is called an open conditional. We don't see anything really special as far as the moods of the verbs go, or the tenses for that matter. But we're going to see another kind of conditional in just a second. This we can just translate quite literally. If someone is in Megara, he or she is not in Athens. This is a different kind of conditional. An unfulfilled conditional expresses what would be or would have been the case. We might also call this a contrary to fact or contrafactual. The present unfulfilled conditional, which expresses what would be the case if something were different than it is formed as follows. In the protasis, we see a, which is like the word for if, plus the imperfect tense of the verb. And in the apodosis, the then part of the sentence, we see again the imperfect tense plus un, which is a particle that is seen often in these hypothetical situations. Here's an example. E eleges e kuamen an. The A is the if eleges, you were speaking, e kuamen, we would be listening. If you were speaking, we would listen. We would be listening. So the implication, of course, is that this you is not speaking. This is an unfulfilled conditional in the present tense. It's contrary to fact. But if you were speaking, we would listen. Here the A plus the use of the imperfect in both protasis and apodosis tell us the sort of conditional we're looking at. It's very important with conditional sentences in Greek to analyze them and pay careful attention to the tenses or the moods we see in the protasis and apodosis, and also to the form of the if and the little particle un. This is the second type of conditional sentence we now have looked at. Let's look at one more. The past unfulfilled conditional, which expresses what would have been the case if something had been different, is formed as follows. In the protasis, we see a, just as in the present unfulfilled conditional, except now we see the aorist. And in the apodosis, also aorist plus un. So instead of the imperfect, for the present unfulfilled conditional, what would be the case, we see the aorist. For the past unfulfilled conditional, what would have been the case. Here's an example. E elexas e kusamen an. So I took that same sentence and through those imperfect verbs into the aorist, and we get if you had spoken or had been speaking, we would have listened. The implication, of course, is that this you did not speak, so this we did not listen. Now, a wrinkle here. Because the verb emit does not have an aorist form, by the way, its imperfect form, which we've learned, is used even in past unfulfilled conditionals where we typically need that aorist. So for instance, e sapas ein e kusamen an. So if he had been wise, we would have listened. This ein there is a third person singular imperfect tense form of ame, I am. So he, she, or it was, literally. But here in this kind of construction, where we see the a in the protasis, and we see the aorist plus un in the apodosis, we're going to translate it as he had been. If he had been wise, we would have listened. Past unfulfilled condition. And again, we know that this is a he we're talking about, of course, because sapas is masculine. If it were e sape ein, if she had been wise, e kusamen an, we would have listened. Negation in conditionals. Me is used to negate the protasis of a conditional sentence, u the apodosis. E me sapas ein, uk an e kusamen. If he had not been wise, we would not have listened. For the forms of these, you can take a look at pages 46 and 62. And for further reading, I would encourage you especially to look at the aorist tense and aspect on page 61 and conditional sentences. Thank you very much.